Today we're going to be looking at the Rolex 126610LV Green Bezel Submariner or Starbucks or Cermet. But first, we're going to be showing you the 5 things to look for when it comes to replica Submariners. Let's head over to the watchmaker's bench. So, now that we're at the bench, what's up? The crystal is the first thing you want to look at. The height of the crystal, you can actually see from the side profile of the watch that the crystal is nearly flush with the bezel on the authentic, and on the replica watch it's about double the amount of height, which is very minimal on the authentic, but that's definitely one thing you want to look for. And of course, like most people know, right at 6 o'clock on all Rolex crystals there is a laser engraved crown. Mostly can't see it with the naked eye unless you have a black dial. You can very subtly see it. They're trying to replicate on a much higher level so that they can achieve closest quality to the actual Rolex quality. We won't promote this in any way, shape, or form, but we do want to educate ourselves and others because these watches do exist. As you can see, the crown is just as good, if not better somehow, so they have the same manufacturing techniques as Rolex. Since we're already close to the bezel, with any rotating bezel we like to do a bezel ASMR, so here's that. Let's hear what the authentic sounds like. A replica. So even with a naked ear, you can hear that it's a higher frequency. Subtle differences in the way that the rotation of the bezel feels, but for the most part, I'd say 90% similar to the authentic. There are different factories that make these watches. This particular factory got the typeface wrong on the font of the date wheel. This area of the 3, you can see that there's a significant peak in this particular number 3. If you want to scroll to the 3, for example, and just look for that particular point, if it is coming from this particular factory, which I know has a very high quality and high quantity of watches. The third thing we want to look at is the rehout. By the way, if you don't know what the rehout is, it's the inner ring on the inside of the bezel. It has a crown at 12 o'clock. The word Rolex is repeated all the way until you get to 6 o'clock, which is where you have your serial numbers. The surface finish on the rehout is extremely subtle. It helps to have a loop. In different refractions of light, you can see that Rolex is achieving a very specific surface finish on the rehout, and I have yet to find a replica that is achieving that exact same surface finish. When the light reflects off of it, you'll see the letters more or less clearly than you would on replica. You can see that the authentic watch, the letters are perfectly in line with the minute indices, specifically this X right here on the replica. The X is not perfectly in line with this minute marker. You can investigate the other letters and you'll probably find that not all of them are perfectly centered to the minute indices. It's not as simple as looking at the dial, looking at the font. They are achieving a black lacquer Rolex subdial better than I've seen in recent years. Videos like this probably fuel their knowledge of what they need to improve. In reality, they're never going to achieve 100% accuracy. The factory's not in Geneva. They don't have Swiss standards. They're trying to make something as close to this quality as they can at the lowest cost that they can do it. The next thing we're going to be looking at is the overall case and bracelet surface finish. The Submariner is very different than the Daytona and the Datejust because it requires lapping polishing. If you look at this 9 o'clock side of the watch, in this case there's a special process requiring lapping polishing, which basically determines how flat and how polished your surface is, and it keeps your edges sharp. If you polish it incorrectly, you won't have sharp edges. It's very noticeable. If you look at the replica, you can see that all of your edges are sharp. They're obviously using some form of lapping polishing technique. I would say the overall sharpness of these corners are 90 to 95% accurate to the authentic watch. You're looking at something that is extremely difficult to distinguish as fake just by looking at the external overall cosmetic of the watch. Their time and energy is very noticeable based on the outcome. There's one particular part that is on the clasp. The hook that's on the clasp is soldered. It's the only component that's soldered onto the clasp. If you look at where the hook attaches to the clasp, it should be a flawless spot welding surface, basically a series of points. It looks perfect, the distance between each point, and there's no discoloring because soldering requires a lot of heat. Stainless steel will change color and temper in different temperatures. Overall, you have your Rolex stamps, your Swiss made stamp. If you look under a microscope and you measure the height of the letters or the thickness of the letters, there will be microns difference between these things. From the standpoint of you going to a dealer and saying, hey, I'm interested in this watch, and having it in front of you, every watch is going to be different. I'm sure the font or the logo is totally jacked up on a different replica, but this particular watch basically hits that 90 to 95% mark, except for the movement, and that's what we're moving on to now. Let's look at the surface finish. You can immediately see they are using brass, they are rhodium plating the brass, they are using the same surface finish in the same areas. They're even filling in the engraving with gold. Pretty significant difference in the surface quality. It's worth mentioning that the power reserve and the frequency of this movement movement is identical to the 3235, as well as 98% of the components in this movement. You can take a Rolex component, put it into the fake, and it will most likely fit because they're reverse engineering this movement. But the balance in hairspring, that's always what you want to look for. In all cases, Rolex uses parachrome blue hairsprings. They all have Breguet overcoils. That means that the hairspring has two planes and the upper coil is very noticeable. The blue parachrome color is very noticeable. It's much more vibrant. You can see in the replica, the blue is very dull. I think they're taking a standard hairspring alloy and somehow coloring it blue. The hairspring is blue really as an homage to the steel blue hairsprings that they used to use in watches. Those are very vulnerable to temperature change. So recently, in the last few decades, they started using an alloy that is much less vulnerable to temperature change. What you want to look for are the inertia weights. This is a free-sprung balance. Again, in the Daytona video, we dive into a little bit more what that means. If you don't see weights on the balance, if you don't see that vibrant blue overcoil hairspring, then you're not looking at Rolex components. Hopefully with those 5 things, you've learned a little bit about maybe authentic Rolex, but definitely about this particular replica. One of the best that I've seen. There is a 116610 black bezel version. It's the previous reference that we'll be doing in a future video. I think that's the best that I've seen. Honestly, these watches on the street, in authorized dealers and boutiques, no one will be able to call these out based on the quality that they're achieving now. So if you want to be able to identify them, you really have to look for the details, and that's what we're trying to provide you with here. And of course, always check your box and papers. If you want to see more on that, you can click on this link, which takes you to our Daytona replica review video where we talk in depth about the box and paper authentication process.